In this episode, we're going to talk about enforcing Windows security policy in a way that scales, because secure settings only matter if they are consistently applied and consistently maintained. Beginners often imagine policy as a written document, like a list of rules someone created, but in Windows environments, policy also means the actual configuration state of machines and accounts. If your policy says passwords must be strong, but your systems allow weak passwords, then the real policy is whatever the systems do. Windows uses centralized mechanisms to push configuration and security settings to many machines, and the most important of those mechanisms is group policy, GP. We'll focus on the concepts behind group policy rather than tool steps, and we'll also cover the idea of template thinking, including the role of security templates often associated with INF-style configuration definitions. The goal is for you to understand how Windows turns security intentions into enforceable settings, how those settings reach computers and users, and why disciplined template thinking helps prevent drift and confusion over time. A helpful way to understand group policy is to see it as a rule delivery system tied to identity and scope. Policies are not just random settings sprayed everywhere. They are settings applied to specific targets based on how those targets are organized in the directory. In a domain environment, computers and users live inside a structure that can represent departments, locations, or security tiers, and group policy objects, GPO, can be linked to parts of that structure. You can imagine it as placing policy packages onto branches of an organizational tree so that everything on that branch receives them. The key beginner concept is scope, meaning which computers and which users are supposed to receive which rules. If scope is sloppy, you end up with policies that break systems or grant unexpected permissions, and then people start carving exceptions that weaken the entire design. Good policy enforcement starts with clear scope and the idea that different kinds of systems may need different baselines. Group policy works by applying settings during system processing events, especially at startup and at user sign-in, and then refreshing periodically. You do not need to memorize the timing to understand the principle. The system has a cycle where it checks which policies apply and then makes sure the machine and user settings match those policies. This is powerful because it creates a mechanism for correction over time. If someone changes a setting locally to something less secure, a policy refresh can bring it back into compliance. That is why group policy is often described as enforcing a desired state. However, beginners should also understand that enforcement depends on correct configuration and on the system being able to retrieve and process policy. If a machine is not properly connected, or if policies conflict, you can end up with inconsistent outcomes. So group policy is not magic. It is a systematic approach to configuration management that still requires careful design. One of the most important mental models for beginners is the separation between computer configuration and user configuration in policy thinking. Computer settings apply to the machine regardless of who logs in, while user settings follow the user to whichever machine they sign into, depending on the environment and policy design. This distinction matters because many security settings should be machine-based, such as firewall behavior, audit settings, and secure configuration of system services, while some settings are user-based, such as certain restrictions and user environment controls. Mixing these concepts can lead to surprises, like a secure desktop setting that seems to change depending on who signs in. If you keep the model clear, you can predict behavior. Computer policy hardens the host, and user policy shapes what a user session can do. For security, both matter, but they solve different problems. Another core concept is precedence and conflict resolution, because real environments often have multiple policies that apply at the same time. If a computer belongs to a domain, and it sits in an organizational unit, and it also matches certain filters, it might receive multiple policy packages. When those settings overlap, Windows must decide which one wins. Beginners often assume policies simply stack in a friendly way, but conflict can create unexpected results, especially if different teams manage different policy layers. The key is to design for clarity, using baseline policies that apply broadly, and then more specific policies that apply to narrower scopes. When you do this well, you avoid having many policies fighting each other, and you reduce the chance of someone accidentally overriding a critical security control. Policy design is like architecture, because you are building a structure that must remain understandable years later, not just today. Now let's connect this to the idea of security baselines and template thinking. A baseline is a starting set of security settings that represent a minimum acceptable level of protection for a category of systems. For example, you might have one baseline for typical user workstations and another for servers, because their roles and risk profiles differ. Template thinking means you treat these baselines as reusable patterns rather than one-off configurations. In Windows security history and practice, security templates have often been represented using configuration template formats that can include INF-style definitions for certain security settings. The format is less important than the idea. You define a bundle of security settings in a consistent, reviewable way, and you apply that bundle to systems. This helps you keep a coherent posture because you are not reinventing security on every machine. Beginners should see templates as the security equivalent of a standard recipe, where consistency prevents accidental omissions and makes changes easier to manage. Security template thinking also encourages you to separate intent from implementation detail. The intent might be to require strong passwords, to prevent local administrator misuse, to enable auditing, and to enforce secure network settings. The implementation is the specific settings that achieve those goals. When you build templates, you document and version the settings so you can explain why they exist and what they are supposed to accomplish. This is important because security settings are often misunderstood, and misunderstood settings are often disabled. If a team cannot explain why a setting is there, it becomes a target for removal when it causes friction. A template with clear intent is easier to defend and easier to evolve. It also supports auditing because you can compare a system's current state to a known template baseline and identify drift. A critical part of enforcing policy safely is verification, because you want to know what is actually applied, not just what you intended to apply. In large environments, small scoping mistakes can have big consequences, like applying server settings to workstations or applying restrictive user settings to administrative accounts. Verification habits include checking that systems receive the correct policies, confirming that key security settings are in the desired state, and investigating inconsistencies rather than ignoring them. Beginners sometimes think of policy as a set-and-forget system, but in reality, policy enforcement is a living process. Machines come and go, organizational structures change, and new applications create new requirements. If verification is missing, policy can silently drift until it no longer protects what you think it protects. The safer view is that policy is a feedback loop. Define, apply, verify, adjust, and repeat. Another concept that matters is the balance between security and operational reliability. Policies can be powerful enough to break functionality if applied carelessly, which can trigger emergency rollbacks that weaken security. Safe policy enforcement starts with testing on a small, representative set of systems before wide deployment. It also involves staged rollouts and clear rollback plans, so you can correct mistakes without panic. From a beginner perspective, you should understand that a security control that repeatedly breaks systems will not survive politically, because operations teams will pressure to remove it. A control that is thoughtfully tested and rolled out gradually is more likely to become a stable part of the environment. This is one reason template thinking is valuable. It encourages deliberate baselines and controlled change rather than constant ad hoc tweaking. Policy enforcement also interacts with accountability and auditing. When policy is centrally managed, changes to policy become high-impact actions because a single policy change can affect thousands of machines. That means the policy management process itself must be protected, with limited administrative access and strong change governance. Beginners sometimes focus only on endpoints, but in Windows infrastructure, the policy control plane is a crown jewel. If an attacker gains access to policy management, they can weaken defenses, deploy malicious settings, or create persistence that spreads everywhere. So enforcing Windows security policy is not just about endpoints receiving settings. It is also about ensuring only authorized administrators can modify the templates and GPO configurations. This idea ties back to least privilege and strong administrative separation because the power of central control must be guarded. By understanding group policy concepts and template thinking, you gain a scalable view of Windows security that goes beyond individual machines. Group policy provides the delivery and enforcement mechanism, while templates and baselines provide the content and structure of what you want enforced. When you design scope carefully, manage conflicts deliberately, and verify outcomes consistently, you create an environment where security settings are not just aspirations but reality. The beginner takeaway is that policy is most effective when it is standardized, repeatable, and observable, because those qualities make it durable and defensible. As you continue, you'll see how these policy mechanisms support auditing and forensic readiness as well, because consistent settings and consistent logging make it much easier to detect misuse and investigate incidents without guessing what each machine might have been configured to do.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.